Law Practice Group with the Federalist Society. I'm also on the leadership team at the National Security Institute. And both of those institutions have kindly sponsored today's event, so we thank them. And with that, I will introduce our second panel today, which is Artificial Intelligence, Implications for National Security. The moderator for today's panel is Jamil Jaffer. He's the founder and executive director of the National Security Institute at George Mason University's Scalia Law School. Previously, Jamil has worked in the private sector at IronNet. He's also held a number of legal and national security positions with the federal government. With that, I'll hand it over to Jamil.
Great. Thanks Matthew. Thank you to the Federalist Society for having us here today. I'm thrilled to introduce a terrific panel that's going to be talking to us about artificial intelligence, implications for national security. I'll start going from my right to left. So first we have Professor Claire Finkelstein. Claire is the Algernon Biddle Professor of Law and Professor of Philosophy and Director of the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law, Searle, at Penn Law. Her current research addresses national security law and policy with a focus on the ethical and rule of law issues that arise in that arena. In 2012, she founded Searle, a nonpartisan interdisciplinary institute that seeks to promote the rule of law in modern-day conflict, warfare, and national security. In 2019, she was senior fellow at FPRI and has written a number of books and texts in this space, including being a co-editor of the Oxford Series on Ethics, National Security, and the Rule of Law, and a volume editor of 4 of its titles. Professor Finkelstein has briefed Pentagon officials, U.S. Senate staff, JAG Corps members on various national security issues in law and practice. She's a does frequent appearances in radio, broadcast, and print, and published op-eds in the New York Times and The Hill. Her prior scholar work, prior to focusing on national security and ethics, focuses on criminal law theory, moral and political philosophy, jurisprudence, and rational choice theory. She's also the editor of Hobbes on Law, Ashgate Publishing, 2005, and is currently completing a book called Contractarian Legal Theory. Great. So we're glad to have you, Professor Finkelstein. Immediately to my right is Raymond Marks. Raymond Marks is a retired senior partner at Alderman Porter. He specialized in international law. He's also a vice chair of the Business Executives for National Security and a frequent contributor to the National Interest, where he writes on national security issues. To my left, Mark Montgomery, senior director at the Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation, where he leads the Foundation for Defense of Democracy's work on advancing U.S. prosperity and security through technology innovation. He also directs CSC 2.0, the follow-on to the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, where he was the executive director. Previous to that, Admiral Montgomery served as the policy director for the Senate Armed Services Committee under the leadership of Senator John McCain, where he coordinated policy efforts on national security strategy, capabilities and requirements, and cyber policy. He served for 32 years in the U.S. Navy as a nuclear-trained surface warfare officer, retiring as a rear admiral in 2017. His flag officer assignments included Director of Operations at J3 at U.S. PACOM, Commander of Carrier Strike Group 5, and a variety of other roles in the U.S. Navy. He has graduate degrees from the University of Pennsylvania, University of Oxford, and completed the U.S. Navy's nuclear power training program. Admiral Montgomery, glad to have you here as well. And certainly last but certainly not least, my colleague, Professor Jeremy Rabkin, who's a professor of law at the Anderson Scalia Law School at George Mason University. Before joining the faculty in June of 2007, Professor Rabkin, for over 2 decades, was a professor in the Department of Government at Cornell University. He serves on the board of directors of the U.S. Institute of Peace, originally appointed by President Bush in 2007, and then for a second term by Senator and President Barack Obama, where he was reconfirmed by the U.S. Senate in 2011. He also serves on the board of academic advisors of the American Enterprise Institute and the board of directors of the Center for Individual Rights, a public interest law firm based here in D.C. His books have included Law Without Nations, Princeton University Press, 2005, and he's published articles in major law reviews and political science journals, as well as in the Washington Post and Wall Street Journal. So we have an awesome panel, a great group of folks, and I'm just going to jump right in. Professor Finkelstein, if you could sort of kick us off, talk to us about, when people talk about AI and machine learning, they can mean a lot of different things, right? They can mean, there's a variety of things they can mean. So talk to us about the different aspects of AI that are out there. What are we going to talk about today? And why does any of this matter for national security?
Well, Jamil, first of all, thank you so much for having me on the panel, and thank you to the Federalist Society. I've spoken frequently on Federalist Society panels, and they're always good, well-organized, and there's always a lot of discussion and debate, and I expect no less from today's panel. So this is a hot topic, as many people may realize. I would say about at least half of the invitations I receive these days are to speak on this topic, and it's interesting why there is so much fascination about it. We might get into that discussion. But one thing that I think I can do to kick us off is to present you with a brief taxonomy of the topics in this area, because there's a lot of confusion about what we mean about AI in the national security space. So the first thing that I'd like to distinguish is autonomous weapon systems, or autonomous systems from non-autonomous or semi-autonomous systems. So a lot of the time when people talk about AI in the national security space, and there's a lot of debate around this, they're talking about autonomy. Now, you know about autonomy in self-driving cars. That has been all in the news, but what is autonomy in the national security space? Well, right now, it's just a concept. There are no fully autonomous either weapon systems or surveillance systems, and by fully autonomous, I mean something that would select its own target. And as I'm sure we'll get into, the Department of Defense actually requires under its guidelines, 3000.09, that any system that is used be still compatible with reasonable human control. And that there be a human in the loop. But also our technology is not up to it at this point. So it's an idea that has captured not just popular imagination, but it is being hotly debated in military circles and in the Pentagon about whether or not we could or should ever introduce fully autonomous technologies into, for example, the lethal kill chain. And that's something I'm sure we'll discuss and debate. So autonomous versus non-autonomous weaponry. Then another distinction that we can talk about is robotics, the introduction of robots into the national security space. That's not the same as autonomous weapon systems, and you'll see a lot of debate about stop-killer robots. Those folks who feel that way are fusing probably the concept of autonomy with the concept of robotics and the introduction of robots into the national security space and into the military. I work with roboticists at University of Pennsylvania, and once again, I can assure you that we are nowhere near the introduction of autonomous robots into the national security space. They are still working on trying to get a robot to effectively, pick up a piece of paper from the floor. But there are lots to debate there from an ethical standpoint, and it's worth discussing because sometimes these technological advances come on us a lot faster than we're anticipating. We never know when we're going to round the corner. Then we can talk about generalized AI. So that's a third category that we ought to think about. And generalized AI is in use everywhere. So it's in use in our daily lives, of course, but it's heavily in use in the military in the form of weaponry. So you might remember that the Israelis took out an Iranian nuclear scientist whose name was Fakhrizadeh, and that was done with a remote-controlled AI-powered or a technologically assisted machine gun, right? In that sense, AI is very common. And so we mustn't confuse when you hear AI, you mustn't immediately leap to, oh, we're talking about robots or we're talking about autonomous weapons systems. And there are lots of different kinds of AI. When we talk about AI, of course, we're also talking about the information warfare and the bots and the use of information tactics and all of cyber. So this is potentially a vast topic with very fuzzy edges, and Jamil, I'm sure, will direct us to the right corners of it to discuss today.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Claire, for that laydown of some of the areas we might talk about today. I do want to turn to you, Raymond, and talk to you about one of the particular areas where we've heard some debate about AI. Right? There's been a lot of discussion about this idea that AI and the fight for control over it, or the underlying information that allows us to achieve some measure of artificial intelligence, or permit or support machine learning, is the competition we're in with other nation states. That we're in a competition for success in AI algorithms, a competition for success in training AI, gathering data that's needed to train AI with nations like China, and that we might even be losing that race. Talk to us about the implications of AI for us in the national security domain when it comes to potential competition with China, competition over algorithms, competition over data.
Thanks, Jamil. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I came down from a little village in New Hampshire called Freedom, and I think that matches very well with the core values of the Federalist Society. So it's fun to be here. Thank you. Yes, artificial intelligence, AI. I'm not an engineer. I can't really tell you what artificial intelligence is, but I do know that in order to fuel artificial intelligence, you have to have data. And data is the new oil of the 21st century. Data is by far the most precious strategic asset that any state can possess. Data is required to develop artificial intelligence. And you need more and more and more data to create effective and advanced artificial intelligence. And which country has the greatest comparative advantage with respect to data? That country is China.
I was going to say
far.
us. Damn it.
You were going to say Belgium, but I know. No, it's China. It's China. And they have an enormous advantage over us strategically. Further complicating the problem is that the Europeans, the European Union, yes, we talk about data with them, but what's that all about? We're talking about privacy law, privacy considerations. All of this has got to be dramatically flipped around. We have got to form strategic data alliances of the West in order to be able to address the challenges posed by China. I'll just stop at that point. I think that's enough. I think
that's great. Yeah. No, I mean, so and by the way, we're gonna ask some questions here of the panel, and we're gonna have a conversation with them. But we also want to have a conversation with you. So, in a little bit, we're gonna turn to you for some questions. So be thinking of questions, ideas that you have. And if you do want to jump in ahead of me getting all my questions out, please put your hand up. I'm happy to call on you out of band. But Admiral Montgomery, one of the things that we just heard from both Professor Finkelstein and Mr. Marks is that look, there's different kinds of AI. There's different ways you might think about the problem and conceptualize it in national security. You might think about some of the ethical issues. And I want to come back to Professor Finkelstein about some of the issues and ethics. But I want to talk to you about security. You've spent a lot of time. You spent the last few years really focused on cybersecurity as the executive director of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. If Mr. Marks is right, the data is the new oil, right? How are we securing that? Are we doing a good job securing it? Should we be worried about the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, the North Koreans? And if we should be worried, are we as a nation architected right to protect the algorithms, the data that are at the heart of this global competition over capability and data?
Yeah, thanks. Get my mic. That's a good question, and I agree on the importance of data. I probably would say that we have enough data, right? And this isn't one of these things where we shouldn't have data envy of the Chinese. I think we have more than enough data to protect, and we do crappy enough job protecting it that we don't need to worry about the Chinese data. AI, though, will really change cybersecurity, and not just for the good. I mean, there are some advantages to to having, putting AI into your cybersecurity environment. You've probably heard of threat hunting, the idea of, doing signals-based techniques, going out looking for the adversary in your systems. AI is going to make that a lot more effective. When we assess like good companies, your former company, that when their anomalous activity detection on a network is 90% or greater, it's effective. You want to get to 100%. AI, when added in, can get you up to very close to 100%. You have to worry a little bit about AI, though. We see a lot of false positives. One thing about having it, which is a false detection of an existence of something that a human might not have been fooled into believing. But still, AI can drive your threat hunting capability much higher, and it can even start to teach you. It can use data to do behavioral analytics and understand how the adversary is moving around your system, maybe even predict where she or he is going next. So it really helps in threat hunting. It helps in vulnerability management. Vulnerability management is like the burden of cybersecurity. There are 20,000 new vulnerabilities identified a year on the major software systems we run. So there are literally millions of vulnerabilities out there. And you have your systems looking through them. That's a very computer power and human interface intensive experiment. AI can really help you do that. In fact, AI is good enough that we're seeing it start to detect unknown vulnerabilities. I mean, this is the kind of thing where you finally solve the Don Rumsfeld problem. You would know your unknown unknowns running this AI. So I really think there's there's some help in vulnerability management. And finally, it really is going to make our systems more efficient. Our network management is going to get more efficient. When you have more efficient systems that use less power, use less data stowage in their job, that makes you more efficient and easier to protect. So it has all these advantages. But all you have to do is flip the scorecard over and see that on the other side, the adversary is going to have that AI. She or he will be able to use it to improve their malware, improve their mutations. They'll be able to study you, figure out how to penetrate you more easily. So they're going to have some of these same advantages. And of course, the real killer in AI is you do need a lot of data. You cannot run. AI has limited value on discrete sets. If you're looking at very limited things, then it doesn't generate enough coin flips to kind of make a decision to make itself more efficient and effective. And it does use a ton of power. It's not Bitcoin power, but it's our blockchain power. But it does use a lot of power, physical, kilowatt power. And so these are issues we have to think about. But in reality, AI, if harnessed properly, will make you more secure. I think that the offense always has an advantage in cyber attacks. I think AI overall will serve to the advantage of the defender in knocking down that offensive advantage. If used properly, and there's some pretty big ifs in there.
Well, this is good. We're gonna have a good debate about this question about whether AI is more effective on offense or defense. I like that point. But I do want to ask Jeremy about this question. By the way, it's so funny for me to call my colleague Professor Rabkin Jeremy, because when I was in college, I actually read some of his work that he wrote when he was at Cornell. So it's a weird honor for me. But I want to talk to you about the international space when it comes to AI, right? We've talked about how there are potential ethical issues at place, particularly with autonomous weapons, and we're going to talk to Claire more about that. We've talked about the competition with China. We've talked about the potential cybersecurity threats. But there are efforts afoot, or perhaps efforts were afoot at one point, to try and come up with an international scheme to think through some of the tough questions in AI and set out a framework. Talk to us about what's going on in that domain. Is there a plan? Is there any hope? Should there be a plan, if any? And talk to us about what's going on in the international domain when it comes to, in the international law domain when it comes to AI. Jeremy.
Yes. First, I want to say I think that we are using this term AI too promiscuously. No one actually agrees on what is the meaning of this term. My son works for Google. He's a software engineer. He has a PhD in computer science. I said, well, I'm going to be on this panel. Just like, what do you think is the most generally accepted definition of AI? And he said, in my professional opinion, there is no generally accepted definition of AI. We've had gadgets which operated on their own, at least since World War II. We had torpedoes in World War II which listened for propeller noises and would like reorient themselves. You could call that artificial intelligence. They weren't too smart. They frequently attacked American ships. It'd be better if they were smarter. I just want to talk about the weapon side of this.
Yeah.
So there is an international convention which started in 1980, the Certain Conventional Weapons Convention. And basically the idea of this is we can't agree on everything, but couldn't we agree on just individual kinds of weapons which are improper? Using lasers to blind a pilot. That's terrible. And everyone's like, oh, yeah, that's terrible. Yeah. So we have, okay, that's been prohibited. And there are a bunch of little things that happen.
So you can shoot the pilot down, you just
Correct.
can't blind him
Correct.
with a laser.
Correct. And that's because people are like, ooh, laser, that's unfair. Bullets would be okay.
Bullets are fine. Right.
Yes. So
missiles, great.
Yes, and
lasers,
I think,
not so good.
Yes, and I think what
Can
that
you burn the? Can you laser the plane, destroy the plane with a laser? You just can't blind the pilot.
I think that's what it's about. Is
Right.
blinding. But I think that is an example of we could agree on somewhat peripheral things that are not going to affect the strategic balance. There was a big campaign by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International and some small countries to say we shouldn't have killer robots. And the campaign against killer robots started, I think, like 10 years ago, and there were negotiations about this year after year after year, and it turned out that although a majority of countries that had signed on to this framework convention, certain conventional weapons should be prohibited. Now we just have to fill in the details, which ones. Russia was opposed, the United States was opposed, Israel was opposed, Egypt was opposed, India was opposed. Pakistan said we're opposed unless India says no. So every country that actually is thinking about preparing itself to fight said no thank you, no. We could get into a discussion.
Because they want killer robots?
Yes, or at least they don't want to have a ban before they've seen what these things can do. Of course, they don't call them killer robots. That's what the opponents call them. So there are a lot of advantages to having devices which can be programmed to go after a certain target. Maybe you don't want to get into this right now, like the merits back and forth, but I'll just say, I think that experience shows that we are either not going to have an international convention to control this, or we will have a somewhat meaningless convention which will be signed by all the countries that don't have the capacity to do it anyway or are willing to lie about what they're doing. Even regarding capacity, I think that this is more complicated than you might think. It was just recently in the news, Azerbaijan has been using these drones that are powered, that have AI capacity to find their target. Damn, when you get down to Azerbaijan, you realize that this is like really out there in the world, and this is a product manufactured in Turkey. So I think the cat is out of this bag, and it's going to be very hard to control. And there really will be this difficulty, even if you're extremely optimistic and you think we can get a lot of countries to say that they won't develop these weapons. It's going to be very hard to detect cheating until they use it. And they may not use it until it's a really decisive battle and it really matters. So I think the prospects of coming to agreement are very poor, and the prospect of actually having effective control are even more poor, because you probably only get to, quote, a treaty with a lot of people a lot of countries having their fingers crossed behind their backs. I just mentioned in this connection, somewhat strangely, China has all along saying, oh yeah, this is a good idea. Yeah, maybe we should the regulations on this. I think it's somewhat unlikely that they are negotiating in good faith.
So
Can I add one thing to that?
Yeah,
Just say
please.
that in cybersecurity, back in 2000, we negotiated, I was part of an NSC team that negotiated with Lavrov and a previous job of his, and the Russians and the Chinese were absolutely happy to sign
Yes, yes.
a cybersecurity treaty for which they had no intention and no other indication in
Yes.
terms of their resourcing and budgeting
Yes.
were they going to adhere to it.
And one of the first things, right, the famous Reagan slogan, trust but verify.
Right.
This will be hard to verify until it's too late.
I think impossible.
Yes, in real life, impossible.
So
Yes.
one of the challenges in this space, right, Claire, is this question of if you have these autonomous weapons systems or killer robots or however you want to frame it. I know that's not a preferred framing, but how do we think about the ethical issues in this space? What are the ethical issues in play? And Jeremy's given us a pretty dystopian view of it, that we're never going to come to agreement, that the Russians and Chinese will, even if they agree, will not actually comply. Mark points out that, we may just have a different point of view, right? Oftentimes when the Russians and Chinese talk about cybersecurity, they mean the ability to control their own populations and prevent the government from or allow the government to control what's happening there. When we think of cybersecurity, we think about enabling our population, but protecting them from external sources. Talk to us about are there similar disputes on the question of AI and the ethics of autonomous weapon systems? And if so, is there any hope of resolving them at sort of a larger international level, even if it just means amongst the Western nations?
Yeah. So these are great questions, and I very much appreciated what Professor Rapkin talked about, because I agree with 99% of what he said. But let me just start from a general observation, which is people have a tendency to blame the technology for the ethical or legal problems that we confront. For example, you hear a lot of people saying, well, if we have autonomous weapon systems, then our principles of responsibility will go out the window because they're going to make decisions on their own and we won't know who to hold responsible. Or you hear people blaming the advent of drones for civilian deaths, and there have been a lot of civilian deaths with the use of drones. And so it seems like that's a fair point. However, there have been a lot of civilian deaths with other kinds of technologies, right? A lot more civilian deaths, right? Look at what's going on in Ukraine right now. So let's try to separate out the question of what are the new ethical and legal problems that this sort of technology brings to us versus what are just ethical dilemmas and legal dilemmas that we face in national security and armed conflict that are the same old problems we've always faced, right? And the question is, how much is the technology really adding to our problems? So I think it is a very legitimate question whether or not the advent of truly autonomous systems would bring a new level of danger and a new level of complexity. As one of the engineers that I worked with said, if you think about swarm technology, namely very large numbers of autonomously functioning robots, you might be justified in saying this is a new kind of weapon of mass destruction, right? You can imagine, there's a very fascinating book by a national security expert named Paul Scharr called Army of None, right? You can imagine a situation where human beings are almost replaced in war as the kind of far extreme of this kind of development. Again, we're very, very far away from that. But the question is, do we foresee that at the bottom of the slippery slope that we're currently at the top of, and do we need to do anything about it as we start to think about that? And is it necessarily a bad thing to imagine autonomous weapon systems fighting each other? Well, there are many, many complexities here that I think are new and are worth thinking about carefully. One of the profound complexities is we don't know what autonomous weapon systems do when they encounter each other. So there's a famous incident that happened between a Google bookseller and Amazon, I believe, some years ago, where these two pricing mechanisms, one, I don't know which one was which, let's say Amazon priced all of its books 1 penny less than the lowest book on the market, and Google priced its book at 1 penny more. And after a week, an ordinary paperback was selling for $1 million before somebody caught it and stopped it. So when you imagine that kind of technology unleashed in war with lethality, we should be humble about the fact that we have no idea what these systems would actually do if they're out there encountering one another. And another important point that goes with this is really human vulnerability in war is part and parcel of how we understand constraint in war and the basic legal principles that constitute our law of armed conflict, or as they would say in Europe, international humanitarian law. So, for example, the principle of distinction, which is a bedrock principle in our law of armed conflict, which distinguishes combatants from civilians. I think robotics introduces an enormous challenge in maintaining the principle of distinction. How do we fully distinguish who a civilian is and who a combatant is when we're using advanced technologies that are placed onto a battlefield with very indefinite boundaries, and of course very indefinite temporal boundaries as well, not just indefinite geographical boundaries as we have seen from the War on Terror. And civilian scientists and technologists and other sorts of civilian infrastructure that helps now to create, to implement, and to control this technology. The interface between the private and the public is increasingly complicated, and that's one thing that technology does bring to us. Action at a distance, lack of vulnerability, proportionality. Another critical principle in the law of war is the principle of proportionality, which is the question of when it is legitimate, what level of civilian deaths and injury and infrastructure damage to risk for the sake of military objectives. It becomes extremely hard to calculate proportionality, even to estimate proportionality when we're talking about unpredictable robotics or AI-powered devices. So I think there's a chance that the furthest reaches of technology in this area would introduce a kind of complex randomization into armed conflict that we are not fully prepared to deal with in a way that semi-autonomous weapons have not. And that's why the DoD Directive 3000.09, which still requires, and has recently, just a few weeks ago, been reaffirmed by the Department of Defense, still requires that there be a human in the loop, in effect, as we say. I think is the right way to go for the moment, because we just don't know how these technologies are going to operate when we take humans out of the loop.
I was actually going to ask you a question about this, Mark. So I know you got something to say, but I want to ask you a question. So we talk about these idea of truly autonomous weapons and swarm technology and the like. I mean, you've had deployed experience with systems like Aegis and the like, right? Talk to us about those are, in theory, could be autonomous systems, right? You could set your Aegis, defense system to knock down whatever's coming your way. Talk about how this works in the field, and Claire talked about some of the DoD constraints, human in the loop, and the requirement. Talk about how this works in sort of a practical sense. So
Exactly. There's three levels. There's human in the loop, where the human's making the decision. There's human, he or she could be fed information from systems, but in the end makes a fire decision. There's human on the loop, where you're observing something happen and you have the ability to command by negation, stop an event from happening. And then there's human out of the loop, where we have had that system for 40 years. So one of the things that's really interesting is that Professor Rapke mentioned some of these things have existed for a long time. So human out of the loop, which means You put what's called Aegis Auto, lean back. There's nothing you could do, and the Aegis weapon system executes based on the doctrine you taught it and what it sees. So that's those three choices in there.
And this is a missile defense system.
It's a missile defense
ships,
system
right?
for a ship, and I commanded ships for a number of years, 7 or 8 years of having these ships under my command, or I was in command of, and I would never ever have wanted to have it in Aegis Auto because I just felt I can't control. You can't control things. There's kind of a do no harm dictum on the front end of most military officers' thinking in terms of making sure that you don't commit collateral damage. And being in auto made you feel like you wouldn't have the control to make sure it was safe. And so I've never met. In fact, one of my commanding officers said, I'm going to put this thing in automatic because I'm uncomfortable in this threat environment. I would have backed the ship off and then tried to figure out if the problem was the ship or the captain. But that would have not been an okay answer. And so
even though we've had this capability, if somebody were to actually use it, you might question their own command capability.
Yeah, I would question their judgment because I just think man out of the loop or woman out of the loop right now is it's not the way we fight. It's not, and it removes the opportunity for good judgment.
So can I ask a question though?
Yeah.
Is that a lack of comfort? Is that is that because the systems aren't smart enough? If you had a smart enough AI system that operated like you thought a human would, is it just a question of they're just not that good yet, or is it something you'll never be comfortable with a computer doing what, admittedly, very flawed human beings probably are doing okay? I mean, the Vincennes, right? This is sort of the example, right? Talk to us about what happened with the USS Vincennes. Most of the people in the audience probably aren't even old enough to remember that, but talk to us what happened there.
Sure.
That wasn't, as far as I recall, it wasn't automated. There was bad data, but it was humans making decisions on bad data. Talk to us about what happened there, and does that have any relevance to this debate?
So that's interesting. The Vincennes was a cruiser during the middle of the tanker wars in the Arabian Gulf. We were escorting, and we'd already had a couple exchanges with the Iranians. And an Iranian F-14 and an Iranian civilian airliner took off at the same time from an airfield. And the radar switched, at one point switched what's called the IFF, or identification friend or foe, transponder signal. They flew very close to each other. And probably the military plane intentionally flew reasonably close to the airliner, but that's not relevant to the end story of this. The end story is, the airliner came directly flying over, as it should have, on a flight path over the Vincennes, and the Vincennes felt it was an F-14 doing it and engaged it and shot it down and killed seveul hundred Iranians.
Civilians?
All civilians. And I think they were going to Mecca at the time. I think it was that time of the year. And it was a horrific accident. The system was not an automatic. It had automatic features enabled. Some of the automatic features were involved in the mistake. In the end, humans made the big error. So humans make errors, and there are, for every B-1, for every UAV error we've had, which still involves a human. The UAV weapon is released by a human in Nevada somewhere or Arizona. We've had a B-1 error where it's on a plane and it's released by a human who's riding in the plane. So human error occurs all the time. I don't know that I'd ever get safe in my lifetime. My son's a midshipman. Maybe if he stays in the Navy his whole career, he'll be safe with artificial intelligence, man out of the loop by then. I will tell you, what will drive us to man out of the loop is the wrong thing. It's that the adversary goes to man out of the loop. And man out of the loop, we are moving to man on the loop. I think I'm going to reread the DoD instruction. I think there are times when there's man on the loop, watching the loop. And we're allowed to build weapon systems that do that.
I think that language is not in the DoD directive, but it's certainly a concept, and the question is whether or not man on the loop is sufficient.
Yeah, and I think over time we will get there on our own.
But we'll get comfortable.
We'll get comfortable. But the reason we'll go to man out of the loop, will be because our adversary does it,
and we can't keep up.
And we can't keep up in that. I'll give you one thing. Now, you're all way too old for this, but there's a movie or way too young for this, called The Bedford Incident. I don't know if you ever read it. It was
I'm too young for this.
Dano,
I'm pretty old.
Dano from Hawaii Five-0 was the star of this, but in the middle of it, it's a U.S. hunting a Russian submarine, and the CO turns to the warfighter, and he has nuclear-armed weapons to take care of the Russian submarine. It's during a heated time in the Cold War, and he says, look, when when I want to fire, I'm going to turn to you and say, fire one. And the guy takes off his earphone and goes, fire one eye. And he fires the missile and starts a nuclear war. So I'm really afraid of getting, that in auto, we're going to get to the position, we are driving ourselves to an unsafe position probably. But I do think if the Chinese, having read a lot and studied a lot of their thinking, I think if they believe that it has a asymmetric advantage to them against the United States, they'll eventually move to it, and I think it'll move us to it. And I think that's I think authoritarian regimes take a different attitude towards combat casualties, collateral damage. So I think we could easily move ourselves to man out of the
Yeah,
loop.
and I actually want to bring Raymond into this conversation. So talk to us about, Raymond, about this question of the way we think about this problem and the way potentially our adversaries think about this problem, right? Is there a delta there that's going to cause us a challenge? And as you point out, then, should we be making not just strategic data alliances, but strategic alliances around how these weapons are used and when they're used? And can we potentially combat this adversary tendency that might lead us into this type of warfare by creating alliances? Is that even an option for us?
Well, I'm going to go to a broader point because I'm not an expert on autonomous weapon systems or on the ethics of autonomous weapon systems. But the title of this panel is Artificial Intelligence and National Security. And I do know from my working with China and with organizations and groups that work with China that the bigger threat by far with China and artificial intelligence is going to be non-military. I know Taiwan's a problem. I know we've got to avoid nuclear war with the Chinese. I was just back from Indo-Pacific Command, Pacific Fleet. I'm well informed as to the tensions and the challenges of taking them on 4,000 miles from our shores immediately off their coastline. But the real challenge, and what the Chinese believe, to a great extent, they see this military stuff as a strategic feint. They see us as falling more and more behind, trying to spend our money on defense and the budget, the rabbit in the wheel.
The way that we looked at the Russians.
The way we looked at the Russians, and they are trying to do the same thing to us. They are trying to do the same thing to us. And where the real angle of attack is, there was a book written January 17th, 1992 by Colonel Kia and Colonel Wang, and it's called Unrestricted Warfare. And the Chinese say everything is war. That's a quote from the book. They believe in fighting beyond traditional military means. Civilians are warriors. The Chinese believe that the first rule of unrestricted warfare is that there are no rules, with nothing forbidden. And the Chinese intend to win this war, which they believe they are waging against the United States. As we are sitting here, they are going to wage this war without violence.
What does that mean? So
What they are going to do, and this goes back to artificial intelligence and what President Xi said in 2013. The vast ocean of data, just like oil resources during industrialization, contains immense productive power and opportunities. Whoever controls big data technologies will control resources for development and have the upper hand. This isn't just big data for an Aegis system or for military weapons. This is big data for the development of economies and to becoming the world's dominant and controlling economies. And what about data in China? They own all of it. All of Apple's data in China is owned by the Chinese. They will not allow Apple to transfer that data to the United States. Even worse, under Chinese laws, they reserve the right to nationalize any and all data generated in China by anyone, by any foreign direct investor. So that's what we face. And so data and artificial intelligence are inseparable. And to develop the world-class artificial intelligence, to be globally competitively, economically, and all that, we're going to have to engage in a terrific mindset. We're going to have to move away from the Spartan mindset the military mindset of getting ready to fight. And a lot of us have served and we fought. We understand that. But this challenge is a lot bigger, wider, and deeper with that. And that's what I mean when I talk about artificial intelligence and national security.
So, Jeremy, one of the points that I think Raymond just made is this question of, sort of stepping back and away from the weapons pieces and talking about this larger economic fight and way of thinking about warfare and influence in the global domain. And AI is at the heart of that too, right? There's this question about if we are the first in technology or the most capable or the best at it, we're more likely to win the economic fight. At the same time, right, Claire makes the point, right, that human vulnerability, right, in warfare tends to be a constraint, right? When we're putting human lives at risk, whether it's economically or militarily, that can constrain the tactics we utilize, right? AI potentially exempts us out of that human vulnerability problem, right? If we're able to put robots to war and they're able to be somewhat autonomous, right? We've largely taken the human, if not just out of the loop, but out of the threat equation, right? Does that change how we should think about it? And if it does change how we should think about the warfare scenario, where does that put us on Raymond's point about economic capabilities and the like, and the fact that we're not just fighting this militarily, we're fighting this war economically. If we lose on the technology front, we lose writ large. It's a compound question.
I was going to say, could you repeat that? Let me make 2 points, which I hope are somewhat relevant to your question. Actually, 3 points, quickly. The first is, I think it's probably right what Raymond said, that the Chinese don't actually envision World War III as a kinetic war in which there are things flying back and forth and then there's ruins afterwards. But we have a real interest in military capacity short of World War III. I mean, there's a lot of things that we may want to do in the world which don't involve head-to-head confrontation with China. So I wouldn't write off the military just on the assurance that China doesn't want to directly engage our military. We still might want to do things in various parts of the world. There might be important things to do. There might even be things which China is exacerbating the situation, or Russia, as in Syria. And for that, a lot of these weapons could be really good to have. So, don't take that off the table. That's the first point.
And I didn't see Raymond as suggesting that.
Oh, no. I wasn't saying it as like we're in a debate. I'm just like reminding you that even if he's right, which I think he probably is right about the very big picture, it doesn't mean that the weapons side of it becomes irrelevant. Second point, it's great that China is saying we're mobilizing. I mean, it's not great, but I mean, it's what totalitarians say. This is how they think. We will win because we will do anything and we will mobilize everything. And that means we will have to triumph. But actually, we've learned some things from the 20th century.
It's Khrushchev banging his shoe on the table.
Yes, it's Khrushchev banging his shoe on the table, right? Actually, that is kind of stupid, because if you want to be smart, you want to have access to a lot of smart people. And you will not have access to the benefit of their smarts if you say, we'll tell you what to do. Just listen to us. Follow our directives, right? We got to be a very advanced country because the government didn't think to tell everyone what to do. China is at this very moment making itself stupider, because the other thing Xi Jinping is doing is saying we have to re-centralize. Things have gotten too loose. Let's put up more Mao pictures. Let's talk about Xi Jinping thought. And he's starting to attack their tech engineers. Like, people know about this in the tech world. He's actually, instead of, which he ought to be doing, stroking those people and saying, you're the heart of everything we're doing, he is saying, well, you guys are a little bit threatening. So I don't think it's true that because it's totalitarian, it's invincible and it's going to be better and better and stronger. I think the reverse. I mean, it's actually, no government should take on itself the responsibility of directing the intelligence of its society and think it's going to make the country better off. Yes, I want to make this one very brief third point, which is we were talking about in the loop, not in the loop. That's really confusing to me. I don't know what those terms mean. I don't think there's like general agreement on what any of that means. But if we're talking about, let's say, economic warfare, using all this data to do economic harm, I really want humans in the loop there. I do not want that on autopilot. I mean, there's something to be said for weapons where you have to make a split-second decision. Like, is this the target I was supposed to strike? That's one thing to say, like, go ahead, we trust you. We think you'll do better than humans who don't actually do so well under pressure when they're quickly deciding what to do. If you're making a kind of strategic decision or even a tactical decision about what should we undermine or distort or confuse, let's say, in the banking system of another country, that shouldn't be on autopilot.
Fascinating. So you would take the decision to potentially take a life,
Yes.
whether at small scale or large scale,
Yes, of course.
and allow it to be automated, but you wouldn't give that same authority if it were to cause large economic harm.
Well, so the first thing is,
Seems like that should be reversed.
yeah. So the first thing is, I don't think it's actually necessary. Like, there's not an advantage to like speed when it comes to
fair.
disrupting their
All right, so you can
economy,
be slower,
which there can be in battle. That's the first thing.
Okay, all right.
But the second thing is, I'm assuming that we are not extremely irresponsible in deploying these weapons, and so we're unleashing carnage. It's actually not a good use of smart weapons to use them stupidly.
Right.
Like, the Russians are doing tremendous destruction, no AI, no smart guidance. They just throw a lot of shells at these towns in the Ukraine.
Schools, hospitals.
Yes, anything. It's completely indiscriminate, right? But if you're talking about smart weapons, the premise of, well, why do we use these weapons that cost $1 million a piece is because we want to be discriminating.
Well, yeah, and so this is actually a point I want to get to you about, Claire, because this is one of the big things that I've never really understood in this debate over smart weapons and robots fighting and drones, right? One of the people seem very uncomfortable, right? Sort of as humans, we're uncomfortable with these decisions being made autonomously and it not being a human in the loop, but all of these evolutions in weaponry seem to actually made war much more humane, much more likely to be, much more likely to have less civilian casualties, right? Because we're very careful about putting a drone and a small weapon in a window, in a room where you can just take out the terrorists in that room and not the kids next door, right? It seems to me that these innovations and the advent of artificial intelligence that gets human flawed mistakes or anger or all those things out of the equation, these might actually make war and the like more humane rather than less, but that doesn't seem to be the tendency. What am I missing, and why am I I think you made a good point, which is human frailty makes us more cautious, right? If we take human frailty out of the equation, is that the problem? Does it escalate more rapidly if it's just robots fighting robots?
All right, well, look, what has the war in Ukraine taught us?
Yeah.
I mean, let's look carefully at this because it is defining the present era and it is transforming the national security landscape. Yeah. We thought wars like this were done. We thought they were more or less over. We thought wars were, I mean, I've spent 20 years studying the war on terror. I've almost forgotten how to think about true international armed conflict. I had to start dusting off these old books. Why? Because the Russians are, is one area where I disagree with you. They're not fighting indiscriminately. They're targeting civilians.
They're doing it on purpose.
They're doing it on purpose. Of course they are.
And we're doing nothing about it.
We are doing. That's a whole nother. We could talk about that for a long time.
They're not targeting particular civilians. Which
they
is why they
may
don't need
well
guided
be.
weapons, right?
But they. That's right. It's indiscriminate weapons to target civilian infrastructure.
What we would call terrorism in any other context.
And it is
intimidated civilian population.
Not just state-sponsored terrorism, but state-based. Right. So, and in doing so, Russia is attacking the rules-based order in international law.
Or proving it doesn't matter.
And so when Raymond talks about indiscriminate warfare, that is the biggest threat. There I fully agree with him. I fear the Chinese less, let me say, because I don't think that they are interested in terrorizing their fairly stable, if misguided, regime, and they want to survive. I'm not sure about Vladimir Putin. He's dying of cancer. That puts us all greatly at risk. Another topic, back to technology. So I would have said, yes, precision weaponry and drones, for all our concerns about mistaken uses of drones, and the United States has a lot of blood on its hands with this. It is precision technology. It is not indiscriminate, and if you look at our bombing campaigns during the Second World War, they were vastly more indiscriminate because we didn't have that kind of technology. The mistakes we've made have been human mistakes. It's not drones, for the most part, mistaking their targets. It's human beings misinterpreting intelligence. And this is, again,
which is never perfect.
Which is, well, it's never perfect, but also I think if you want to look at where in actual armed conflict AI will be most useful, it's on the intelligence side. It's where we're currently using it. So in the last package, or the time package before last, of weaponry that the U.S. sent to Ukraine, we sent unmanned marine vehicles. They're intended to be used only for intelligence purposes. Now, it's fallacious to think, well, we can introduce a certain technology and restrict its use in war to one kind of use and not another. If we routinely use unmanned vehicles in war for surveillance, we're going eventually to use them in the kill chain. I mean, we just have to understand that you can't cabin technology, and all technology is dual, tri, et cetera,
We can restrict
use.
the software on those particular units to doing certain things.
But we never will. I'm right, in a hardcore battle. And would I want, if there were autonomous weaponry that we could send to Ukraine right now that they could effectively use against the Russians, would I really say no? I mean,
Well, the White House
has to.
is.
The technology, the effective technology doesn't exist. The unmanned marine vehicles are extremely important. And by the way, they're going to be extremely important against the Chinese in the South China Seas, because that's another battle where sea conflict is going to be extremely important. But the biggest questions are not technological questions. The biggest question is, when Beijing invades Taiwan, what are we going to do about it? And we don't know the answer to that right now, right? And Ukraine is a test case for us, right? Economic sanctions are not going to work, right? The Russians are going to likely take over a good portion of Ukraine, and there'll eventually be an armistice that will settle the lines there. Are we satisfied with that result, and are we going to replicate that result in Taiwan, right? So there are human decisions here that the technology is back behind, and the tendency to think, oh, well, it's the technology that's leading us down this path. It's not the technology. It's that we're not clear about how to maintain and enforce the law of armed conflict, and we haven't been clear about the importance of maintaining the law of armed conflict and enforcing it. And this war tells us just how important it is, because there is no compelling international sense that we need to abide by the laws of war. So there are no guardrails anymore.
Well, and to your point, Raymond, you made the point that in China's view of warfare, right, the rules don't matter anyways. If what we're seeing on the ground here is the Russians ignoring the established rules, the rules they've signed up to, right? Do we have any belief that the Chinese or the Russians in a future war, even if we did come to some international agreement about how to use artificial intelligence and what the constraints are, man on the loop, man in the loop, woman in the loop, whatever it might be, is there any chance that our adversaries are going to abide by them? And if not, isn't it just about who gets to the end of the race first?
Yeah, well, first with the Chinese, and this is a quote from the book that's driven their doctrine now for the last 20 years, quote, "Everything is war." It's a completely amoral approach to pursuing war. There are no underpinning moral values. They'll do whatever it takes, whether it's cyber, whether it's acquiring and controlling your companies, whatever. It's all war to them. everything is war. With Russia, more, a more primitive approach. But what fascinates me, and we've got two law professors here, what we're talking about in the first Gulf War, we saw smart weapons for the first time, right? Smart bombs and things. Remember Schwarzkopf saying that was the luckiest man in Iraq right now when that car was trying to cross the bridge, and they let him go. They didn't take it out and all that. The smart weapons have allowed us to become far more precise and has cut down the loss of human life. No more Dresden bombings, all this sort of thing. We can smart bomb them. The Russians have run out of smart munitions, effectively, and they're starting to use the dumb stuff. The question I have for the law professors, are we going to move to a norm? I feel it's sort of trying to emanate and grow de facto a new emerging customary international law doctrine that it becomes inconsistent with laws of war to use dumb weapons in certain situations or circumstances, so that you should only be using smart. Because when you read the New York Times, the Washington Post, it's clear, right? These Russians are bums. They're, these artillery salvos are savage. I actually don't think they're trying to kill civilians in particular.
Really?
I think what they're trying to do militarily and tactically, it's close urban fighting. The Ukrainians are fighting building to building, house to house, and they've got to knock them out. So they're pulverizing those towns. And then they're moving in after the artillery barrages, which is the old classic doctrine. That's what you try to do, or you drop dumb bombs on them. I don't think they're actually trying to engage in mass civilian massacres. If they were, they'd probably hit Kiev massively, right? They'd go a lot broader. Actually, and I know everyone's going to become angry with me, actually, I think the Russians have been fairly restrained. It's totally against the conventional wisdom, but they could have done a lot worse. But I think it's dumb weapons versus smart weapons, and I don't know whether international law is going to catch up with that or whether we feel it should. That's a question for the professors.
Well, I do want to go to the audience for questions in a second, but I know that Jeremy and Claire probably have something they want to say, so let me go to you guys, and then we'll go to the audience for questions. So folks, the audience, get ready to ask some questions. If you don't have any, I've got plenty, but hopefully you will have some. Jeremy.
Yes, the premise of the question is that we have this reliably functioning system of upholding, clarifying, and enforcing the law of armed conflict, which is of course not.
Clearly has gone out the door. If it was ever in the door.
I think it wasn't very much in the door. So this whole discussion about what Russia is doing is just abstracting from, actually the last time they fought a really serious war, they behaved monstrously.
The exact same way.
And we said, oh, okay, well, I mean, they suffered a lot, and never mind. We had decades of debate in America about, was the Anglo-American bombing strategy in the Second World War excessive? Maybe it was excessive. Dresden, shouldn't we feel bad about that? We never once raised the question, was it a little excessive for them to rape every woman in not only Germany, but also Poland on the way there? We didn't say anything against what they did, because they were our allies, and we didn't really expect too much of them, and never mind. And you could go through every major conflict. There's been horrible things happening on the part of non-Western armies, and we're not too concerned about that, because really what we mean by the law of war is something for Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International to accuse Western states of violating. I mean, this is not a thing which is reliably in effect. And if you ask, which do you care more about, winning or getting a good score on your compliance with the law of armed conflict, I think many Western states will hesitate, which is more important, because the wars they've been fighting since 1945 have been peripheral. Russia is not hesitating on that one. It's for winning. And whatever you want to say about China, I think they're also going to opt for winning.
Claire?
This is an incredibly complex topic, and I think wanders very far away from our AI topic, but I'll make a couple of remarks. First of all, I think there's no question, Raymond, that the Russians are targeting civilians. I just can't interpret their actions in any other way. and indeed worse than targeting civilians earlier on, and this is, Ukrainians have given up on this, but the agreements to establish humanitarian exit corridors and then to bomb those corridors is extraordinary perfidy in war, and not like something that we saw every day in the Second World War, though there were obviously terrible, terrible actions, not only by the Russians, but also by Ukrainians. Let's not forget that, during the Second World War. Jeremy, do I think that, do I agree with you that the law of armed conflict has never really been in effect, and that everyone is always
Not everyone.
in that?
Not everyone.
We constrain ourselves.
Except we constrain ourselves, right? This is a very complex question, because we have come out of we came out of the Second World War with an attempt to establish a series of principles, norms, laws that were real, and the emergence of a system that respects sovereignty, the sovereignty of nations, and respects basic laws of war that are of ancient origins, but to codify those, to clarify those, to establish agreements based on those. I don't want to minimize the impact of that, not just for Western constraint of itself, but for the whole concept of war. And I think that the Russians will, to some extent, pay for the war crimes they are committing. They will pay for it in multiple different ways, not just with the few Ukrainian war crimes trials, but with the international community. Were they fighting a cleaner war? I don't think we would have gone to the level of sanctions that we've gone to. Now, they're not doing much, but there is an important consensus around this, that I think the United States would strengthen its hand with other nations if we clarified our own practice. And I don't think that means that we necessarily weaken ourselves in fighting with our adversaries. Ultimately, I think we strengthen ourselves. I just want to make one comment about the Chinese. And an important topic that we haven't talked about, but it's in this domain, which is the concept of lawfare. The Chinese have an extraordinarily sophisticated lawfare practice in which they study Western international armed conflict principles and laws and use those principles against us. We know this from armed conflict all over the world, but the Chinese are the best at it. And that's in some ways good news, because the irony is they're still paying attention to those principles, even if to manipulate them. So in an ironic sense, I think the law of armed conflict is partly still alive in our interactions with China, because they know we're studying them, they're studying them, and we have the difficult task of figuring out how to stick to the law of armed conflict without thereby weakening ourselves with regard to our adversaries.
So, and I know that Jeremy and Mark want to say something. I do want to jump in. I do want to go to questions from the audience, but I do think it's an interesting scenario. I mean, we saw what happened right after the Russians started attacking civilians directly, and I tend to agree with you that I do think they're targeting civilians intentionally in an effort to bring the war to ordinary Ukrainians and force their government to concede, essentially using siege-style tactics, but more aggressively actually attacking civilians directly. But so we saw the president come out and say there's a genocide going on. Whether he's right or not about that, we can debate, right? But he said it. The Secretary of State from the podium said Vladimir Putin is guilty of war crimes. Has that a trial, but he said it. Okay. But then we're doing nothing about it. So what does it matter that we have these words, war crimes and genocide? And we accuse the Chinese of genocide. President Trump did it first. President Biden did it next. And we still sent our athletes to the Olympic Games, and everyone celebrated. And yes, we had a diplomatic boycott, but nobody seems to really care all that much that the Russians are killing civilians or that the Chinese are interning 1 million Uyghurs. We all talk about it, and it's all great that Congress passed a law, but if we don't do anything effective about it, what does it matter that we have these laws, these ethics on the books, and the fact that Chinese pay attention but don't follow them? Like, does it matter? And if it does matter, why? Mark, Jeremy?
So first, I do, and I think people understand this, but I had 7 or 8 years of command, making warfighting decisions, and we certainly have, not just because you have a judge advocate general whispering in your ear, but
Constantly.
But you have there's an adherence to principle that guides all our decision making. So I think we're pretty good there. Do people make mistakes? You bet. And we have accountability systems that hold them accountable. So I think we have a pretty good system there. What's interesting is there's this perception that Russia had a choice. There's only one country in the world right now that can do what's called target mensuration. That's how you very accurately pick a target out from digital imagery, transfer to things for weapon systems, and that's the United States. The other countries haven't really developed this, and on a moving battlefield like we have in Ukraine, look, the Russians are being awful. Their prediction, what they're doing is I think a war crime. But I don't believe they had a choice to target using weapons that would only hit military.
Okay, but they had a choice of going in and
that's
a choice
different.
of going at places where they knew there were schools where they'd been marked by their own people as having civilians, and they could
They
have
have
chosen.
hit
They don't
over 80 hospitals.
But
in
they're hitting
Ukraine.
most
They're
of these.
visible from the air.
But again, the weapons they're dropping the weapons that are coming in from 150 to 250 miles away. Listen, I'm not a fan of what the Russians are doing. I do think they were worse in World War II. I think you really go back and study history on that. That was easily the campaign they waged
Nobody's gonna
from
disagree with
Moscow
that. Nobody's gonna
to
disagree with that.
Berlin
That's right.
was brutal. But
But that should be the rule,
they're
right?
not-
I mean,
yeah.
they're doing better this time, so.
Yeah. No, but I'm just saying, I just feel like there's a presumption of ability. Our NATO allies can't drop weapons accurately without us.
Right.
I mean, there is, like I said, it's a weird thing, this thing called target mensuration, but our ability to write down a target that you add into a Tomahawk weapon system or a JASM, or I don't want to get into all the acronyms here, but to do that, there's only one country in the world that's developed that system. Now, does that mean you then shouldn't do, urban warfare? Maybe. That's the decision. Russia could have chose not to fight urban warfare. Unfortunately, their crazy, dumb tactical plan is to grab urban centers. And they have the one thing they're good at is artillery. So you have a bad plan with a nasty system. This is the natural end result.
All right, so Jeremy, you get the last word, and maybe you can bring us back to AI if you would like to. If not, you're welcome not to. I realize it's my fault. But I can't help myself. We are in the middle of this thing with Ukraine and Russia. We're not as in the middle as we should be.
I just wanted to say, I hope Sarah's right. I recall reading that President Assad was doing horrendous things. Oh, well, never mind. We moved on. I think we do not have a system in place that actually imposes any kind of accountability for people who are determined to get what they want and don't care about
But you think we
violating
should?
it. I don't think we are capable of it. I mean, I don't think the world could sustain it, right? And so I think that we shouldn't be, how to put this, too optimistic about compliance with these rules. And to bring it back to artificial intelligence, I mean, I don't think per se relying on artificial intelligence to enhance our military effectiveness, it per se presents law of armed conflict challenges of the sort of whoa, if we did that, it would be violating the law of armed conflict. I don't see that. But I don't think that we would allow ourselves to be constrained if we were actually in a serious war. And so therefore we shouldn't make commitments that we would find it difficult to keep to, yeah.
Okay. All right, audience, yes, ma'am, in the middle there. I think we got a microphone coming your way.
Really enjoyed the panel. So I come at this issue in terms of the discussion you just had in a more conventional sense of international law is protecting American interests, and it has more to do with actions have consequences than in principles written down somewhere, although those can be helpful. And to that extent, when I look at the topic AI and national security, I'm not so interested in these kinetic wars. Mm-hmm. Fine, Russia takes over Ukraine, that's not good. It doesn't mean they're going to take over NATO. if we look at there's an old saying of CNBC, chemical, nuclear, biologic, and cyber. Particularly interested in the last two, biologic and cyber. For example, with respect to biologic, since the last anthrax scare, nobody's given that a lot of thought, except now we have the question, well, what if somebody were to make up a virus in a lab and
Spread it around the world,
their
man.
adversaries?
For example,
Who would
right?
ever think of that? It's a pretty good way to weaken your adversary's economy. I guess that's only if you could prevent it from being distributed among your own population. But do you have any comment you would like to make about the use of AI in particular the cyber and biologic warfare areas? And I might add that my understanding of what the U.S. response to this is to maintain a very healthy defensive capability along the lines of mutual assured destruction. You do it to us, you're going to get it back, and we're not going to be telling anybody about it.
Claire?
That's the question.
And then Mark?
Wonderful question. I wouldn't discount the importance of AI in kinetic warfare. It's not so neatly separated because AI, generalized AI, is absolutely everywhere. In every system. I mean, nothing operates without a computer, right? The simplest weaponry and the simplest lab research, right? So generalized AI is absolutely everywhere. One topic that we didn't talk about that could be, if we manage to get through this conflict with Russia to a better future sometime, long time in the future, and we go back to more robust space collaboration, is the role that AI potentially plays in protecting us around space warfare, and the kinds of non-direct kinetic conflicts that can arise in space, particularly having to do with espionage, that we've seen a lot of in the past. So there is no way to neatly separate out conventional warfare from AI-powered, infused warfare, because the conventional warfare without AI is a thing of the past, I guess I would say.
Mark, on the
Yeah.
cyber side?
So it's funny. I worked in the White House in 1999 for in counterterrorism, but we brought in some cyber experts to talk to the president. One of them was Bill Joy, and in the middle of it, he just departed the script and started talking about how the future was going to be dominated by biotechnology with gene enhancements, and everyone there was like, well, I think that's, we were talking like the 10 to 15 year thing. And he said this would be here by 2025. I think he's missed that by a little bit. But the reality is AI is going to make his concerns about your ability to get kind of adaptive bioweapons or biotechnology that, can go into the blood, small enough to get into the bloodstream, and to think and act and manipulate is probably realistically now the 5 to 10 years away that he predicted in 2000. So I actually think that the mixing of cyber and biotechnology is a big issue. If you think that we're doing something in the background on that like at Fort Detrick, you can join the Chinese who all said that that COVID came from Fort Detrick. I would not attribute to Fort Detrick 95% of myths about them. I do not think we're working like a mutual assured destruction version of this against an adversary. I do think at private sector labs all throughout the country, we are working this kind of how does AI and cyber tools can it be used with biotechnology to repair problems in your DNA, things like that, as a positive. And we should probably be concerned that our adversaries, whether Russia, China, or the man from U.N.C.L.E., whoever it is developing this kind of, could be developing this kind of weapon. But we are not developing a counter to it, we're not developing a vaccine to it, and we're not developing a mutual assured destruction.
That's a good question. Yeah. So I got one question and then one in the back. Yep.
Yes.
Go ahead, sir.
Yes, sir. Jeremiah, simple old country lawyer. we talk about this, but we forget that we've got international communities like the United Nations, which have been largely effective because of security people on it, like Russia and China. But when you deal with all of this, there is an opportunity to do shared intelligence information that we miss sometimes. Now, having been in the 70s at the UN with the Law of the Seas discussion, I know everybody's going to violate it, but at least we ought to be thinking in AI about how do we get ahead of that curve so that somewhere along the line we get on the same basis and nobody's really out front that we can't control and own that battle space, but more importantly, the space we use it for science.
So Jeremy, can we get to an international? Yeah, I know you've already told us your view on this, but why not? And then maybe Raymond, you can jump in on this.
Well, I mean, I'm sure we can do the equivalent of saying don't use lasers to blind people, pilots. And we can say don't use AI to figure out the special biological vulnerability of pilots. That would be really nefarious. And probably we could get everyone to agree on that because it's so peripheral to anything like important. I don't think you could get a general convention which establishes principles that could then be applied like by lawyers in a follow-on way, because I don't think there's enough agreement. And you will have this problem that China will sign anything and be snickering. Right, and so that just
But that's always true, right? I mean,
well, no, it's one thing if they cheat a little, and it's another thing if our sense is cheating is their strategy. Yeah, as Claire was saying, which I think a lot of people do believe that.
And if we could verify it. I mean, the
We
problem
can't
is
verify
we
it.
can't
That's another
verify it.
hugely important thing. This is, you can track like Iranian nuclear development because you can pick up, Geiger counters can pick up.
maybe, except for all the ones we missed.
Yeah, so we miss them, but still, I mean, it gives off signals, right? It gives off a signature that they're doing purifying uranium. There's no signal here. There's nothing to pick up. And China is such a huge place. I mean, I don't think we have particularly good human assets in China. So I am not optimistic about that at all.
Raymond?
I agree with Jeremy. I mean, you can't make a deal with China unless you figure it's a good deal for you, notwithstanding the fact they're going to be cheating on whatever the deal they've made with you is. That's just a brutal reality, and it's not limited to the military sphere at all. Yeah. Now, with respect to the Law of the Sea, we still are not a signatory to the Law of the Sea, right?
We're signatory, we have not ratified.
We
We've
have,
signed, we've
okay,
not ratified.
right.
Yes.
My point's made. We're not a party to that treaty. So why are we even talking about it? I mean, Jeremy makes the point that, well, it wouldn't, just because the Chinese signed the treaty doesn't mean they're going to follow it. Well, we haven't even signed it. At least we're being sincere about it. So let's keep all that in mind. I mean, realism has some relevance to this, and facts are facts. We're not a party to the Law of Sea Treaty. What kind of signal does that send out to the world? I think the Navy was always opposed to us doing the
No, we're 100%.
No, support of it. The other way
you
around. Yeah,
want-
the other way
what
around.
was
They
the other
want
way?
it. It's everyone else that.
Everyone else that
political,
didn't.
And our line is that I'd rather be a country that is adheres to
Enforcing,
it and
yeah,
is not
enforcing,
a treaty signatory, or and that a country like China that's a treaty signatory and doesn't adhere to it.
Yeah, so we're kind of in the same place, bottom line.
Ma'am in the back? Yep.
Hi, my name is Anthony Jefferson. Thanks so much. Nice to be here. My question was just regarding the gentleman. I think he stated that.
Which one of us is the gentleman?
There are not really rules of engagement, I guess, so to speak, in terms of the AI community or the AI technology. I know traditionally, in some war contexts, there's like an official declaration of war and their rules of kind of engagement. And so I just want a little bit of clarification on what that means, because I know it's on the internet and like how it has, an AI, generally artificial intelligence, how it has it can kind of be, has no really walls or anything, it can be added and I guess, both, in terms of legally and fairly. That's all that's new to me.
So is the question? So I think the question is: are there international rules of engagement around the use of AI, right? And if not, Are we going to be able to develop them, and on what basis? Is that the question?
Yes, because even if there's spoken, there's sometimes tacit rules and unspoken. Tacit, which is like unspoken, and sometimes there's spoken rules.
Right.
So if they're tacit or unspoken, like
Right.
this, you can still have a way of knowing how to operate.
Yeah.
Customs and
Yeah,
morals,
custom-
but
yeah.
If there are spoken rules, how does that work?
Right.
Because it just seems like we're in a world of kind of chaos that would seem kind of
Yeah.
difficult, or organized chaos, like jazz would be a little bit different, I
Yeah.
guess.
So Claire, you spent some time actually looking at how the rules of war apply in this
Yeah.
context, and whether there are sort of customary rules and whether there are actually
Right.
written rules. Tell us about that.
I think it's a mistake, again, to think of AI as separate from everything else that we do in war, inside war, outside war. I mean, you can buy, probably half of you have AI infused ovens in your kitchens. Or, there are AI toasters you can get. I don't know how many people have smart homes, but this is the idea.
Will it stop you from burning the bread? Because I still can't do that.
We can no longer separate AI out from the way that we use generalized technologies, mechanical technologies. And so it's a mistake to think of AI as a special thing. It's part and parcel of our everyday life, and it's absolutely part and parcel of anything that we do in warfare, anything that we do in national security, in surveillance, et cetera. And it is posing a challenge distinguishing the boundaries around war. What is war and what's not war? That is a distinction that is increasingly being eroded. But what we can look at is not generalized AI, but the issue of autonomy and robotics. I mean, that's the further technological hurdle. It really doesn't have that much to do with AI, though, of course, like everything else, it depends on AI technologies. But it really has to do with the issue that we talked about before. How much are human beings vulnerable in war? Just one last thought about this. People were very upset, supposedly, when the bow and arrow was introduced into warfare, because the argument was, this is action at a distance. It's not fair. It's asymmetric combat, right? So we're constantly struggling with this question of human vulnerability in war and the question of honor. One thing I think about the Chinese is they look profoundly frightening to us, but we have not spent enough time understanding their cultural norms, and
Which are very different than
which are very different from ours. And I do believe that the Chinese, as a nation, have a profound sense of honor in personal relations and diplomatic relations, and I think we need to start thinking differently about where the guardrails and the constraints are going to come from in our interactions with China in a way that I think is a completely different template when we're talking about Russia.
I have to intervene, though, and just say I was working in 2015 at PACOM in the White House, and Xi explicitly told President Obama, we will get out of the South. We will not build military installations in the South China Sea. And he explicitly said, I will back off on cyber attacks on your country. And in both cases, 6 months later, they were doing them. So if they have a special regard for honor, I would just say that it slipped a generation with President Xi. So I'm not going to put too much of my, I'm going to.
Well, it's bad on us for accepting that at face value.
Well, but if they have a truly different take of honor, then.
Okay, fair enough.
Russian could have
So
done that.
unfortunately, I see there are many questions. A few of us will stick around afterwards, but it is almost 3 o'clock. We're 1 minute out. So with that, please join me in thanking our panel. And let me just remind folks that if you want to get CLE credit, please scan the QR code on the back. And please join us at the Federalist Society for the 2022 National Lawyers Convention here in D.C., November 10th through 12th, Mayflower Hotel. Thank you very much, and appreciate again Federalist Society and the partnership with NSI. Thanks, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
How does it stop?